The air in Maplewood, Ohio, reeked of smoke and chaos as the last flames flickered out in the late autumn dusk. A house stood in ruins, its charred walls a silent witness to the fire that had nearly claimed everything. Amid the crowd's murmurs and the distant wail of sirens, firefighter Jim Callahan slumped on the steps, his soot-streaked gear heavy with the weight of a hard-fought battle. He saved lives tonight, pulled an old man and his dog from the inferno, but the fight wasn't over. Across the street, a shadow moved through the salvaged belongings' eyes glinting with greed. As a thug's hand closed around a family's cherished keepsake, Jim's weary gaze sharpened. What happened next would become a firefighter tribute whispered across Maplewood, a tale of courage that would leave the crowd stunned and a bully humbled. Welcome to the Firefighter Tribute channel. Before we dive deeper into this story, we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Where are you tuning in from? Share your thoughts or a story about the firefighters who've touched your life. If these stories resonate with you, hit that subscribe button to support the channel and join us in celebrating the inspiring tales of firefighters everywhere. The late autumn sun hung low over Maplewood, Ohio, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of this small town. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke, and the faint wail of sirens lingered in the distance. At the corner of Elm and Main, a two-story house stood battered, its charred walls still smoldering from a fire that had raged just hours before. The Maplewood Fire Department had fought tooth and nail to save it, and now as the chaos began to settle, the neighborhood gathered their faces, a mix of relief and worry. James Callahan, known to everyone as Jim, sat on the front steps of the house, his heavy fire gear streaked with soot. At 32, he was a seasoned firefighter, his broad shoulders and steady hands forged by a decade of facing flames. His dark hair was matted with sweat, and his face, though handsome in a rugged way, was etched with exhaustion. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the cracked sidewalk as his chest rose and fell with deep, deliberate breaths. The fire was out. The family was safe, and for now that was enough. Around him, the scene was a snapshot of a community in crisis. Neighbors clustered in small groups, whispering about the fire's cause, a faulty wire, they figured. A few kids stood wide-eyed, clutching their parents' hands. Across the street, a young woman filmed the aftermath on her phone, narrating softly for her followers. And near the driveway, Henry Thompson, a 75-year-old Vietnam veteran, stood with his daughter Sarah, sorting through a pile of salvaged belongings. Hank, as everyone called him, was a wiry man with silver hair and a face lined by years of hard living. His hands trembled as he held a small wooden box, its surface scuffed but intact. Jim glanced over at Hank, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Just hours ago, he'd carried the old man out of the burning house, Hank coughing and clinging to that same box. Inside were his war medals, photos of his late wife, and a few letters from his time overseas, things that meant more to him than the house itself. Jim had gone back in for the family's dog, a scruffy mutt named Rusty, who now lay at Sarah's feet, panting but alive. That was the job, save what mattered no matter the cost. Hank caught Jim's eye and shuffled over his steps, slow but purposeful. He extended a hand, his grip surprisingly firm for a man his age. "Thanks, son," he said, his voice rough but warm. "You didn't just save my house today. You saved my memories." Jim shook his head, brushing off the praise. "Just doing my job, sir," he said, his voice low and steady. "Glad you're okay." Hank nodded, his eyes glistening. "You're a good man, Callahan. Your dad would be proud." The mention of his father stirred something in Jim. His dad, Tom Callahan, had been a firefighter, too, a legend in Maplewood, until a warehouse fire claimed him when Jim was just a kid. Tom's words still echoed in Jim's mind. "A firefighter doesn't just put out flames, son. He protects what's worth saving. Jim lived by that, even on days like today when his body ached and his lungs burned from smoke. Sarah Hank's daughter joined them, her face streaked with tears but smiling. She was in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Jim, I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You got Dad out, you got Rusty out. You're a hero." Jim chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Don't go calling me that, Sarah. I'm just glad everyone's safe." As they spoke, the crowd's murmurs grew louder, drawing Jim's attention. People were pointing toward the driveway where Hank's belongings, a mix of furniture, clothes, and keepsakes, were piled haphazardly. A man tall and broad-shouldered was rummaging through the pile, his movements quick and furtive. He wore a faded jacket and torn jeans, his dark hair unkempt. Something about him felt off, like a shadow moving against the light of the community's goodwill. "Who's that?" Sarah asked, her voice tightening. Hank squinted, his expression hardening. "I don't know, but he's got no business touching my stuff." Before anyone could move the man, Derek Malone, a drifter, who'd been hanging around Maplewood for weeks, picked up Hank's wooden box, turning it over in his hands. His lips curled into a smirk as if he'd found something worth pocketing. "Hey, Hank," called out, his voice sharp despite his age. "Put that down, son. That's mine." Derek froze, then turned slowly, his smirk widening. He was in his early 30s with a face that might have been handsome, if not for the hardness in his eyes. "What's that, old man?" he said, his tone mocking. "You think you can tell me what to do?" The crowd fell quiet, their eyes darting between Hank and Derek. A few people stepped back, sensing trouble. Jim stood, his exhaustion giving way to alertness. He took a step forward, his gaze fixed on Derek. "Put it down," Hank repeated, his voice steady but strained. "That's my family's history you're holding." Derek laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the tense air. "History," he sneered. "This junk's worth more to me than it is to you, Grandpa. Why don't you sit down before you hurt yourself?" Hank took a step toward Derek, his fist clenched. "I said put it down," he growled. Derek's smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl. He dropped the box carelessly onto the pile and stepped closer, towering over Hank. "You want to make this a problem, old man?" he said, his voice low and threatening. "I don't think you've got it in you." Sarah gasped, rushing to her father's side. "Dad, don't," she pleaded, grabbing his arm. But Hank stood his ground, his eyes locked on Derek's. "I've faced worse than you, boy," he said. "You don't scare me." The crowd murmured, some shaking their heads, others pulling out their phones to record. A woman whispered to her husband, "Should we call the police?" But no one moved to intervene, their fear of Derek's size and aggression holding them back. Jim's jaw tightened. He'd seen guys like Derek before, bullies who thrived on chaos, preying on the vulnerable. He took another step forward, his voice calm but firm. "That's enough," he said. "Leave the man alone and walk away." Derek turned, his eyes narrowing as he sized Jim up. "Oh, look at this," he said, spreading his arms wide. "The big hero firefighter wants to play tough. What's the matter, buddy? Tired from playing dress-up in your fancy gear?" Jim didn't flinch. His exhaustion was bone deep, but his training kept him steady. "Walk away," he said again, his tone leaving no room for argument. Derek laughed, turning to the crowd as if performing for them. "You hear this guy," he said. "Thinks he's some kind of Superman. But I see through you, man. You're just a glorified janitor cleaning up messes for claps." The crowd stirred, a few voices rising in protest. "Leave him alone," a woman called out. "He just saved their house." Derek ignored them, his focus back on Hank. He reached for the box again, shoving Hank's shoulder with enough force to make the old man stumble. Hank caught himself on the pile of belongings, his face twisting in pain. "Dad," Sarah cried, rushing to help him. That was it. Derek's hand shot out, grabbing Hank's arm and yanking him forward. "You're starting to annoy me, old man," he snarled. "Maybe you need to learn some respect." The crowd gasped, parents shielding their kids' eyes. A few men stepped forward but hesitated, unsure how to handle Derek's aggression. Jim's heart pounded, his instincts kicking in. He moved quickly, closing the distance between himself and Derek. "Let him go," Jim said, his voice like steel. Derek sneered, releasing Hank only to shove him hard toward the ground. Hank fell with a grunt, his hands scraping the pavement. Sarah screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. "You're gonna regret that," Derek said, raising his fist toward Hank. Time seemed to slow. The crowd held its breath, their fear palpable. But before Derek's fist could land, Jim was there. In a blur of motion, he caught Derek's wrist midair, his grip like iron. Derek's eyes widened in shock, his momentum halted by Jim's strength. "That's enough," Jim said, his voice low and unwavering. "You're done." The crowd erupted in murmurs, their phones raised high to capture the moment. Derek struggled against Jim's hold, his face twisting with rage. "Let go of me," he shouted. "You can't do this." Jim didn't budge. His training as a firefighter had taught him control, how to stay calm in the face of danger, how to act without losing himself to anger. He twisted Derek's arm behind his back with practiced precision, forcing the larger man to his knees. Derek yelped, his bravado crumbling as Jim applied just enough pressure to keep him in place. "You think you're tough," Jim said, his voice steady but firm. "Picking on an old man stealing from a family who just lost everything, that's not strength. That's cowardice." Derek's face flushed red, his eyes darting around for support, but the crowd's stares were cold, their disapproval clear. "You can't touch me," he spat, his voice cracking. "You're just a firefighter, not a cop." Jim leaned closer, his tone calm but commanding. "My job is to protect people," he said, "and that includes protecting them from guys like you." The crowd burst into applause, their fear giving way to admiration. A young man in the back shouted, "That's right, Jim, show him." An older woman nodded, her hands clasped tightly. "That's what a real man does," she whispered to her friend. Sarah helped Hank to his feet, her hands shaking. "Thank you, Jim," she said, her voice breaking. I thought he was going to hurt Dad." Hank brushed off his jacket, his pride bruised but his spirit unbroken. He looked at Jim, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You didn't have to do that, son," he said, "but you did. Thank you." Jim gave a small nod, his focus still on Derek. The man's struggles grew weaker, his defiance fading under the weight of Jim's grip. "This isn't fair," Derek muttered, his head hanging low. Jim's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "You had every chance to stop," he said. "You chose to keep going. Now you'll face the consequences." As if on cue, a police cruiser pulled up, its lights flashing. Officer Mike Rodriguez, a stocky man with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped out. He took one look at the scene, Jim holding Derek, Hank, and Sarah standing nearby, the crowd buzzing with excitement, and nodded. "What's going on here, Callahan?" Mike asked, his tone professional but friendly. Jim released Derek's arm, stepping back as Mike and another officer took over. "This guy was stealing from the Thompsons," Jim said. "When Mr. Thompson tried to stop him, he got violent." Mike glanced at Derek, who was now handcuffed and glaring at the ground. "That's so," he said, then turned to Hank. "You okay, sir?" Hank nodded, his voice steady. "I'm fine, thanks to Jim." Mike clapped Jim on the shoulder. "Good work, man. We'll take it from here." The officers led Derek to the cruiser, his head bowed as the crowd cheered. Some shouted words of thanks to Jim, while others recorded the moment, their phones capturing every second. Derek struggled briefly, muttering under his breath, but he knew it was over. The cruiser door slammed shut and the crowd's applause grew louder. Jim watched the car pull away, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in hours. He turned to Hank and Sarah, who were still standing by the pile of belongings. "You sure you're okay, Mr. Thompson?" he asked. Hank smiled, a rare softness in his weathered face. "I've been through worse," he said, "but I owe you, Jim, more than I can say." Sarah stepped forward, holding out the wooden box. "Dad wanted you to have something," she said. "Not as a reward, but as a thank you." Hank opened it, revealing his war medals and old photos. He pulled out a faded bronze star, its ribbon frayed but intact. "This was mine from '68, he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want you to have it, not because you're a hero, though you are, but because you remind me of the best of us." Jim shook his head, his throat tight. "I can't take that, sir. It's yours." Hank pressed it into his hand. "You earned it today, son. Take it." Jim hesitated, then closed his fingers around the medal, his eyes meeting Hank's. "Thank you," he said softly. As the crowd began to disperse, their voices carried snippets of admiration. "That was unreal," a man said, shaking his head. "Jim didn't even break a sweat." "He didn't lose his cool either," a woman added. "That's real strength." Jim rejoined his team, checking their gear and making sure everyone was accounted for. His captain, a gruff man named Tom, gave him a nod. "Nice work out there, Callahan," he said. "Not just with the fire." Jim shrugged, brushing off the praise. "Just doing my job, Cap." But the crowd wasn't done with him. A group of neighbors approached, led by an older man who'd lived in Maplewood his whole life. "Jimmy said you're a credit to this town. Your dad would be proud." The words hit Jim harder than he expected. He thought of his father, of the lessons he'd passed down, of the legacy he carried every time he put on his gear. "Thanks," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in a soft golden glow, Jim looked out at the smoldering house. The fire was gone, but its scars remained. Yet in the faces of Hank, Sarah, and the neighbors around him, he saw something stronger than flames: community, resilience, hope. That night, as Maplewood settled into a quiet calm, the story of Jim Callahan spread. Videos of his stand against Derek went viral, shared across social media, with captions like "local hero" and "true courage." But Jim didn't see them. He was back at the fire station, cleaning his gear, ready for the next call. In the end, it wasn't the applause or the medals that mattered to Jim. It was knowing he'd done what was right, that he'd protected what was worth saving. And in a world full of noise and chaos, that was enough. So here's to the quiet heroes among us, the firefighters, the neighbors, the everyday people who stand up when it counts. They don't do it for fame or glory. They do it because it's right, and that, my friends, is the truest kind of strength.